The wind tore through the hollow of her lungs as though it had been sent specifically to remind her of every misstep she had ever made. Snow, jagged and unrelenting, lashed against the carriage windows as if to punish her for daring to leave the world she knew. She pressed her gloved hands to her face, trying to shield herself from the cold and, perhaps, from the realization that she might never reach the safety of warmth again. Somewhere between the forest and the rolling hills, she had begun to understand that the path she followed was neither straight nor forgiving. It was a treacherous lattice of wrong turns and dashed hopes. And now, in this bleak mid-December hour, she feared she had committed the gravest error of all. She had arrived at the wrong estate. The carriage jolted over a hidden rut, and the wheels groaned in protest, echoing the ache that had settled into her chest. Her heart pounded in time with the relentless drum of the storm outside, each beat a reminder that she was utterly alone, save for the small child huddled in the corner of the carriage, shivering beneath a tattered shawl. She had not expected this responsibility, not yet. The child had come to her by chance, a fragile human bundle whose fate had seemed, until now, inextricable from her own. And yet, here she was, trembling and unsure, carrying another life into a world that might neither forgive nor welcome them. The manor loomed ahead, half concealed by the white haze of the snow. She blinked against the wind and pressed her forehead to the frost-flecked glass, trying to convince herself that the structure was meant for her, that the Duke who awaited within its walls had indeed sent word for her arrival. But every instinct screamed otherwise. The carriage slowed, the horses snorted, their breath steaming in the frozen air. The wheels sank slightly in a drift, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt beneath her weight of dread. She had imagined herself stepping into comfort, into firelight and polite smiles, yet all she saw in her mind's eye were derisive glances, whispers, the inevitable judgment of a household unprepared to receive someone so plainly unworthy. The driver called out something muffled, and she forced herself to pull the reins of panic inward, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Her gloves were wet, her gown stiff with frozen condensation, and yet she had to move. With a trembling hand, she opened the carriage door. The wind cut at her exposed cheeks, and she staggered forward, dragging the child behind her. Each step crunched in the snow, leaving shallow impressions that the storm immediately tried to erase. In that moment, the world felt hostile, indifferent, ready to swallow her whole, as though the universe itself were complicit in her humiliation. When the heavy door of the manor opened, a figure appeared, tall, imposing, yet undeniably human. The Duke, as she now understood him to be, stood framed by the warm glow of candlelight. His expression was unreadable, a mask of composure and authority, but his eyes betrayed something subtler, curiosity, a faint tenderness, a thread of recognition that she could not yet name. The staff behind him whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with cautious judgment, yet he seemed impervious to the scrutiny, focused solely on the shivering girl before him. She could hardly speak, words lodged in her throat as if frozen mid-formation. The child clutched at her skirts, silent but trembling, eyes wide with apprehension. The Duke inclined his head slightly, a courteous gesture, and extended a gloved hand toward her. It was a hand that carried weight, not only of authority but of promise. The snow whipped around them, yet within that small doorway, a fragile warmth seemed to gather, resisting the storm. She hesitated, mortified at her own appearance and the perceived impropriety of her intrusion, yet she could not retreat. Not with the child depending on her, and not when this man, this stranger of great consequence, waited for some signal to act. I believe I may have arrived at the wrong address, sir, she stammered, voice thin and brittle. Her cheeks burned, not from the cold, but from the sharp sting of embarrassment that cut deeper than any winter wind. He did not flinch, nor did he laugh, nor did he turn away in distaste. Instead, he studied her with an intensity that unnerved yet oddly reassured her. "If this is not the place you were meant to come," he said, voice low and steady, carrying the faintest trace of a smile, "then it is a fortunate mistake, for you are here, are you not?" She blinked, unable to reconcile the politeness of his words with the strange surge of something warmer, something resembling kindness, hidden beneath the surface of his rigid composure. The child whimpered softly, and he instinctively bent, placing a hand on her small shoulder, steadying her as if to say, without speaking, that they were safe, at least for this moment. The weight of that touch, light though it was, anchored her racing heart. The storm roared beyond the walls of the manor, rattling the doorframe and pressing its icy fingers into every crevice. She took a tentative step forward, dragging the child along, and he opened the door wider, allowing them entry. The warmth of the house washed over her like a balm. Her wet gloves clung to her fingers, her gown clung to her form, but the firelight shimmered off the polished floors, flickered across tapestries, and seemed to whisper of comfort, if only she would dare to believe it. "You are safe here," he said, and the words did not carry authority alone, they carried a promise. A promise that, for the first time since her journey began, she could almost allow herself to hope. She exhaled a breath she had not realized she had been holding, and the child, sensing the shift in tension, pressed closer to her side. Her mind still raced with apprehension, the wrong estate, the impossibility of this life, the silent judgments of unseen eyes. And yet, in the quiet authority of his presence, she felt an unexpected thread of reassurance. Perhaps this was the place. Perhaps this man, whose gaze lingered on her not with disdain but with cautious attentiveness, could be trusted to see beyond appearances, beyond the simple fact of arrival at the wrong time or place. He leaned in, not with force, but with the gentlest inclination of his tall frame, and spoke words that caused her breath to catch, words that seemed to suspend the storm outside, words that carried both certainty and promise. "You are my wife now." The child clutched her skirts with renewed warmth, the smallest smile brushing her lips despite the lingering chill. She wanted to recoil, to deny the audacity of the claim, yet something in the timbre of his voice made refusal impossible. It was not a command. It was not a claim of possession. It was, rather, a quiet promise of protection, companionship, and perhaps, in the fragile recesses of hope, love. She swallowed, trembling, and in that simple, whispered declaration, the world shifted. The storm raged on, but inside the doorway of the manor, the chaos of snow and wind seemed to fade. She had arrived by accident, yet it was here, among strangers and shadows, that a new possibility had been offered. She did not yet understand the journey that lay ahead, the delicate dance of society's expectations and personal longing, but she understood this: she had stepped into a story far larger than herself, and a hand, gloved and steady, would guide her through it. And as the carriage wheels disappeared into the swirling white of the countryside, leaving only footprints and fleeting fears, she realized that the greatest storm she would face might not be the winter wind outside, but the uncertain, tender, and uncharted currents of her own heart. The morning arrived with a brittle chill, slicing through the manor as though the storm of the previous night had conspired to follow her indoors. She awoke to the sharp, metallic scent of winter pressed against the windows, a reminder that the world beyond the warmth of candlelight remained indifferent to her presence. Even in the glow of the hearth, where logs hissed and crackled like whispered confidences, she felt the lingering weight of yesterday's embarrassment, arriving unannounced, drenched, uncertain of her reception. She had imagined herself stepping into a life prepared, a life awaiting her at the Duke's behest, and yet the truth of it now pressed upon her. She was a stranger here, and strangers, in houses such as this, were always measured, assessed, and, more often than not, found wanting. As she dressed, the child still sleeping against her side, the quiet of the manor seemed to hum with scrutiny. Servants moved like shadows along the polished hallways, their whispers muted but not entirely inaudible, each remark a subtle accusation, a question of her worth. She could hear the faint rustle of skirts and the soft click of boots, a symphony of judgment she was ill-prepared to bear. The previous night's warmth had been a fragile cocoon, one that now threatened to unravel in the daylight. She hesitated by the mirror, smoothing her damp hair and straightening the folds of her gown. The reflection staring back at her seemed almost a stranger, cheeks still flushed from the cold, eyes wide with uncertainty, hands shaking slightly with residual fear. The Duke appeared then, not in the grandeur of formal announcement, but in the quiet assertion of authority that made the servants' whispers still. He bore the manner of a man accustomed to observation, to reading intent and character in fleeting gestures, and yet there was no reproach in his gaze. Only curiosity, tempered with the gentlest hint of consideration. She froze, uncertain whether to bow, curtsy, or simply retreat into the corner of the room as she had so often wished to do in her previous life, where embarrassment had been a constant companion. "You have slept," he said, his voice measured yet soft, not a demand but a question poised between propriety and invitation. "The night was long and unforgiving. I trust you are no worse for it." She lowered her eyes, tugging the child's shawl closer. I am well enough, sir," she murmured, though her voice betrayed the lingering tremor of fear and doubt. "I had feared," she stopped, unwilling to articulate the depth of her anxiety, the gnawing thought that she had arrived wholly unprepared, entirely unworthy of the household into which she had stumbled. He stepped closer, offering the faintest smile, a gesture so slight it could have been overlooked, yet it carried reassurance. "Fear not what you have not yet known," he said. "The world outside may judge harshly, but within these walls, judgment is reserved for those who harm, not those who arrive uncertain." Her heart fluttered in a fragile rhythm, half relief, half suspicion. She wanted to believe him, and yet old habits of self-doubt clung as tightly as the frost to the window panes. She could not help but wonder how long this kindness might last, whether it was mere courtesy or something deeper, something capable of bending the rigid rules of propriety in which the Duke, she had heard, held all of his world. Breakfast was served in a room whose grandeur was measured not merely in gilt and crystal, but in the precise arrangement of every utensil, the careful choreography of the servants' movements. The child sat upon a small chair beside her, eyes wide and curious, as though the elegance of the room were as confounding as the manner of the Duke himself. She fed him in silence, mindful of every misstep, every inadvertent sound that might betray her presence as anything less than composed. Yet with every glance, the Duke's attention lingered, not to scold, nor to ridicule, but to observe, to measure, and to protect. It was a peculiar sensation, to feel both weighed and sheltered in the same breath. Later, she ventured into the gardens, hoping for some privacy, some respite from the constant awareness of being watched. The frost had settled into delicate, crystalline patterns over the hedges, and the skeletal trees seemed to shiver under the strain of snow and ice. She had imagined gardens as places of serenity, yet today they felt almost accusatory, reflecting back at her every insecurity, every misstep. A servant appeared, bowing in the distance, and she felt her cheeks flare with shame, as though even the quietest gaze carried judgment. It was then that he appeared beside her, silently, without announcement, as though he had read her thoughts from across the expanse of polished stone and frozen earth. "You need not wander alone," he said, his tone neither commanding nor indulgent, but steady, like the foundation of a house built to endure centuries of storm. "There is no need to face the day's scrutiny without guidance." She started, startled by both his presence and the directness of his concern. "I thank you, sir. I am accustomed to being invisible," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper, carrying the weight of years in which she had been dismissed, overlooked, and occasionally ridiculed. He tilted his head slightly, as though examining the truth of her words, then extended a gloved hand. "Perhaps," he said slowly, deliberately, "it is time to see what it feels like to be seen, truly and without reproach." The child tugged at her skirt, sensing the shift in the air. She took a tentative step forward, hand brushing his in a gesture that was at once hesitant and unavoidably intimate. The warmth of his hand, the deliberate steadiness of his grip, conveyed a promise she had not yet dared to imagine, that she was no longer entirely alone, that protection, kindness, and perhaps even the slow bloom of trust could take root in this strange and imposing household. Throughout the day, she observed the subtle choreography of the Duke's household, servants moving with quiet precision, distant relatives exchanging polite yet pointed words, the invisible currents of gossip threading between them. And yet, she also saw him, calm, observant, measured in judgment, yet never cruel, intervening when necessary with a word here, a gesture there. Tokens of consideration appeared, a warm cloak draped over her shoulders, a cup of tea offered without ceremony but with evident care, a handkerchief embroidered with delicate initials left upon her chair. Each small gift carried the weight of attention, and with it, a quiet intimacy that both frightened and enthralled her. By late afternoon, she found herself walking the corridors with slightly lighter steps, the child at her side, the walls no longer seeming so threatening. Yet the echoes of the morning's whispers, the memory of arrival soaked in cold and uncertainty, lingered stubbornly. She could not yet believe fully that the Duke's protection and attentions were anything beyond courtesy, nor could she entirely suppress the lingering sense of shame that came with being observed, measured, and still found wanting in the eyes of the world. As evening fell, and candlelight flickered against the walls with slow, deliberate rhythm, the Duke appeared once more. He did not speak immediately, he simply regarded her, quiet and composed, until she could no longer endure the weight of his gaze. Then he bent slightly, voice low, near enough for the faintest warmth of breath to brush her ear, and said with quiet certainty, "Whatever the world believes of your arrival, whatever judgment may follow, know this, you are under my protection. Here, you belong. And in time, you may discover that even in unexpected circumstances, hearts may find one another." She exhaled slowly, a shiver running through her, but it was no longer entirely from cold. The child clung to her hand, and in the flickering glow of the manor, she felt a fragile thread of hope weave through her fear. Perhaps she had stumbled upon a sanctuary she had not known she needed, and perhaps the storm outside, relentless as it was, could not touch what had begun within these walls. And yet, as she retired to her chamber that night, the echoes of footsteps and distant murmurs reminded her that acceptance, however tentative, was never guaranteed. Somewhere, in the flicker of firelight and shadowed hallways, the Duke's attentions promised comfort, but the eyes of society would always weigh heavy, and her place in that world remained untested. The final candle guttered, casting long, trembling shadows across her walls, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to wonder, not merely if she belonged here, but whether the hand extended to her in kindness might one day be the only anchor strong enough to hold her heart against the cold. The sound of a carriage wheel crushing brittle frost shattered the fragile calm that had settled over the estate, a sudden intrusion that sent her heart hammering against her ribs as though it feared the world had come to claim her once more. She had begun to allow herself a fragile hope, believing that within these walls, the Duke's gaze had offered her not only protection but the promise of belonging. And yet, the echoes of a world outside, harsh and unyielding, reminded her that trust was a perilous thing to extend too freely. The child in her care stirred, sensing the tension that ran through her like a current beneath still water. She pressed a finger to his lips, urging silence, though the tremor in her hand betrayed her own unease. She wandered the corridors, not by design but by necessity, seeking the quiet refuge of a garden terrace she had glimpsed the previous evening. Moonlight had cast the frost in silver patterns, and she imagined that the world, from above, might seem beautiful and impartial, indifferent to her failures. Yet beauty offered little solace when the heart was a tumult of shame and longing. She leaned against the cold stone balustrade, her breath misting in the air, and felt the weight of all her missteps pressing down. Every wrong address, every whispered doubt, every moment she had imagined herself invisible now seemed to culminate in this fragile hour. A soft sound behind her caused her to start, fingers tightening around the railing. The Duke stood there, framed by the shadowed archway of the terrace, his tall figure imposing yet not threatening. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet understanding that made her pulse both falter and quicken. He stepped forward, boots silent on the frost-laced stone, and the faint warmth of his presence brushed against her awareness, teasing the edges of fear and hope alike. "You should not wander alone at this hour," he said, voice low, steady, and yet carrying the subtle cadence of familiarity, as though he had known her longer than these few days permitted. "The world beyond these walls can be cruel, and even within, uncertainty may find its way." She shook her head, unable to meet his gaze fully. I am accustomed to fear, sir. It follows me as certainly as the shadow of a tree follows the sun. I do not yet know if I am welcome here, or if my mistakes will be the measure by which I am judged." He inclined his head slightly, the faintest acknowledgement of her confession, as though he understood the weight of each word before it was fully spoken. "Mistakes do not define us," he replied. "Nor do they determine the measure of our hearts. Often, it is in our fear, in our missteps, that true courage is revealed." Her breath caught in her throat. Courage had always been a distant, almost mythical concept for her, a luxury afforded to those unburdened by past failures and constant scrutiny. Yet here, in the quiet glow of moonlight on frost, she felt an unfamiliar possibility stir, that she might be capable of something beyond survival, that perhaps she could claim a place not merely in the Duke's household but within his regard, and, more tenuously, within his heart. He moved closer, so that the silver light played across the planes of his face, and she felt the subtle heat of his presence against the cold night. There was a gravity to him that seemed to bend the space between them, a quiet insistence that demanded attention without command. "I know the world judges you harshly," he continued, "and I will not deny it is prone to whispers and scrutiny. But here, within these walls, there is a different measure. Here, you are seen, not as an error, nor as a curiosity, but as a person of worth. And it is my choice to recognize it." The child stirred again, and she bent to adjust his shawl, brushing her fingers against his small shoulder. In that simple act, she realized that her care, her anxiety, and her courage to protect him were not unnoticed, even if the world outside remained indifferent. The Duke's gaze lingered on her, and for the first time, she felt that her presence mattered in ways that were not dictated by society's rigid expectations. "Do you truly believe that someone like me," she whispered, her voice trembling with vulnerability, "could ever find a place among such expectation? That a heart so uncertain could be regarded with anything other than pity or disfavor?" His response was measured, deliberate, and yet carried an intimacy that startled her. "It is not your heart that I measure by the standards of others," he said softly. "It is your courage, your honesty, the depth of your care, and the willingness to step into what frightens you most. You have already proven yourself in ways the world may never see. But I have seen them." Her chest swelled with a conflicting mixture of relief and apprehension. She wanted to step back, to claim the distance she had always maintained, yet every instinct told her that to do so would be to deny the fragile bond forming in this silent exchange. The storm outside, though absent in the manor's warmth, seemed to echo within her, a reminder that every comfort came with fragility, every moment of trust with risk. He extended a gloved hand, hesitating just long enough for her to recognize the deliberate choice in the gesture. "I cannot undo the world outside," he said. "Nor can I shield you entirely from the judgments and whispers that follow. But I can offer this, a measure of certainty in a life so uncertain. And that certainty is mine to give." She reached for his hand, the warmth of his glove a tether to something tangible in a world that had often been cruelly intangible. The child nestled closer, and she felt the fragile beginnings of a hope she had scarcely allowed herself to imagine. In that simple touch, in the quiet gravity of his presence, she recognized an unspoken promise, that even in a world ruled by scrutiny, there existed a place where care and affection might flourish. The hours passed with deliberate slowness, the frost outside glinting like shards of glass under the moon, the corridors echoing with the soft footfalls of servants and the occasional whisper of the wind through the heavy curtains. They spoke little of society or obligation, choosing instead the weightier conversations of fear, longing, and unspoken desire. Every glance, every carefully measured word, carried the potential for intimacy, for connection that neither could yet fully name but both instinctively recognized. By the time the candles had guttered low and the night pressed closer, she found herself seated by the hearth once more, the child finally lulled into a quiet slumber. The Duke remained standing nearby, his gaze a mixture of authority and quiet consideration. "You are not at the mercy of circumstance alone," he said. "Nor are you confined by fear. What matters is the choice you make when faced with uncertainty. Tonight, you may choose to trust, to step forward, even when the path is obscured by shadow." Her hands trembled slightly as she regarded him, the weight of all her previous missteps pressing against the fragile hope now kindling in her chest. She wanted to retreat, to deny the audacity of feeling any warmth, any belonging, yet the gravity of his words made resistance nearly impossible. In the careful, deliberate timbre of his voice, she heard not command, not expectation, but invitation, a hand held out, steady and unwavering, offering a chance to step into a life she had scarcely imagined. And then, as if the world had waited for this quiet moment to assert its presence once more, a distant knock echoed through the manor, a summons that neither she nor the Duke had anticipated. It was faint, almost polite, yet it carried with it the unmistakable weight of intrusion, a reminder that the fragile bubble of connection they had begun to cultivate was never immune to the outside world. The Duke's eyes met hers, steady and unwavering, and for a heartbeat, the world outside the manor ceased to exist. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low, carrying both warning and reassurance. "Even now, uncertainty intrudes. But how we respond is our measure, not the measure of those who would seek to unsettle us." She nodded, heart still pounding, realizing that the day's revelations had shifted something within her. The fear that had once dictated her every action was now tempered by a fragile confidence, by the quiet understanding that perhaps, in this imposing house, she had found an anchor, one as solid as it was unexpected. Yet the knock persisted, a reminder that safety and acceptance were never guaranteed, and that the world outside remained poised to test her newfound courage. As she rose, brushing the child's hair gently from his forehead, she felt the first tremors of determination mingled with fear. The Duke's presence was a tether to possibility, a guide through the storm that raged both without and within. And yet, as the shadows flickered across the corridors, she could not ignore the unspoken truth. For every gesture of kindness, there existed a challenge, a subtle test, and perhaps even a scandal yet to reveal itself. The night deepened, the flickering candles casting long shadows across the polished floors, and she understood that the story had only just begun. The world beyond the terrace and the hearth would demand resilience, courage, and perhaps a willingness to trust in a hand extended not for duty, but for the fragile promise of affection. The knock came again, louder this time, and her breath caught with both dread and anticipation. The morning began with the echo of shattered glass, sharp and unforgiving, slicing through the stillness of the manor like a sudden accusation. A vase, toppled by careless hands, or perhaps by fate itself, lay in fragments across the polished floor, petals scattered like the remnants of a promise. The heroine's heart lurched, not at the destruction itself, but at the realization that the world beyond the manor's walls would not wait for her to find her footing. Whispers of scandal traveled swiftly in such households, and she feared the fragile thread of acceptance she had begun to weave might unravel in a single, careless moment. She hurried to gather the scattered blooms, fingers trembling with both shame and frustration, when the Duke entered, his presence commanding yet strangely gentle. His eyes swept the room with calm authority, noting the debris without a hint of reproach directed at her. It was not criticism that filled his gaze but understanding, the rare acknowledgement of human frailty that both startled and relieved her. "You need not shoulder blame for what is unintended," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of both consolation and quiet command. "Mistakes, even those that appear monumental, are seldom the measure of one's character. And yet, they reveal resilience. You have the capacity for far more than you perceive." Her cheeks flushed, a mix of mortification and tentative pride, as she bowed her head in acknowledgement. I only wished to prevent further disorder, sir," she murmured, her voice trembling with the effort of composure. "I fear I am often more an inconvenience than a presence of value." He stepped closer, so that the warmth radiating from his tall frame brushed against her awareness. "Value is not measured by perfection, but by courage and the intention behind each act. You have shown both, and in truth, that is far rarer than flawless execution." The child, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, clung to her skirts, eyes wide and curious. She knelt to adjust his shawl, finding solace in the tangible responsibility that grounded her in the present. The Duke's gaze lingered, unwavering, as though the simple act of care revealed more about her than any formal introduction or conversation ever could. In that quiet observation, she felt both exposed and protected, an emotional paradox that left her breath caught and heart fluttering in ways she could scarcely name. Later, the Duke summoned her to the drawing room for the pre-Christmas gathering, a modest assembly by societal standards, yet brimming with the potential for scrutiny and judgment. Relatives and friends, attired in their finest, exchanged polite greetings with smiles that never fully reached their eyes, their subtle glances carrying the weight of whispered speculation. She moved with deliberate care, each step measured against the expectations of a world she had never fully understood, aware that any misstep might invite scandal. Yet the Duke remained close, a quiet anchor amidst the swirling currents of polite society. He introduced her formally, his words measured and deliberate, conveying both authority and personal regard. "Allow me to present my wife, newly arrived, whose presence I am fortunate to count among these walls." His tone carried no ambiguity, no room for doubt. The declaration was as much for the household as for the world beyond. She felt a tremor of both fear and exhilaration. The murmurs of the assembled guests rippled through the room, a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and guarded approval. Eyes that had once seemed poised to judge now lingered with quiet acknowledgement, as if the Duke's unwavering confidence in her worth had, by extension, granted them permission to see her as she truly was. Throughout the afternoon, small gestures deepened their connection in ways subtle yet profound. He guided her with careful attention to the formalities of social interaction, anticipating questions and preempting potential faux pas with quiet efficiency. Every whispered word, every discreet nod or smile, carried a hidden intimacy, an acknowledgement that their bond was private even amid the public stage of the gathering. She began to understand that affection could be cultivated not only in stolen moments but within the bounds of propriety, a slow burn tempered by restraint and elegance. The child, safely ensconced in the care of a trusted servant, occasionally peeked from behind a curtain, eyes wide with curiosity at the elegance and ritual that surrounded them. She smiled briefly at his fascination, recognizing in him the same mixture of fear and wonder that had accompanied her own arrival. In that mirrored innocence, she found a grounding force, a reminder that the future could hold warmth and stability even amid uncertainty. As the sun dipped low, casting elongated shadows across the parquet floors, the Duke led her to a quieter chamber. Here, away from the polite scrutiny of guests, he allowed the intensity of his presence to speak in ways words could not. His gaze lingered, unyielding yet tender, and she felt the first stirrings of a trust that surpassed mere obligation or duty. "You have endured much in your journey," he said softly, voice carrying the weight of observation and care. "Yet you have emerged not diminished, but strengthened. That is a rarity in any heart, and one that should not go unacknowledged." She struggled to find words, for the depth of her relief and fear made language inadequate. I do not yet know if I am capable of belonging here," she admitted, voice barely more than a whisper. "I fear I am still too uncertain, too fragile." He stepped closer, the warmth of his hand brushing her own as he offered quiet reassurance. "Fragility does not negate worth. Even the most delicate heart may wield courage and resilience beyond measure. You have already proven this to me." Their eyes met, and in that gaze, a subtle confession passed, one neither spoken nor formally acknowledged, yet undeniable in its intensity. It was the quiet acknowledgement that intimacy, trust, and perhaps love could take root even in the most formal of settings. The storm of judgment outside and the rigid expectations within the house seemed, if only for a moment, to recede in the presence of their shared understanding. Yet the gathering was not without its complications. A cousin, ambitious and sly, approached under the guise of polite inquiry, questioning the timing of her arrival and her understanding of social etiquette. The Duke intervened with quiet authority, deflecting the inquiry with a single, measured statement that both protected her and reinforced the reality of her accepted place within the household. The cousin's surprise and silent concession underscored a new truth: her presence, once uncertain, was now formally recognized, though the currents of society remained ever watchful. After the guests had departed, leaving only the quiet crackle of the fire and the faint scent of pine and candle wax, she felt a tension within her release slightly, replaced by a tentative exhilaration. She had survived the scrutiny of society, not unscathed but unbroken, and in doing so, had glimpsed the power of the Duke's steadfast attention and protection. He remained near the hearth, leaning slightly against the mantel, eyes steady, yet his presence filled the room with an unspoken promise. "The world outside may continue to whisper, to speculate, to judge," he said, voice low and deliberate. "But within these walls, there is a different measure. Here, your courage and your care are recognized, and in time, perhaps even admired." She nodded, feeling a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the firelight. The day's trials had revealed not only the fragility of social favor but the strength of the bond forming between them, a bond that could withstand scrutiny, misunderstanding, and the lingering shadows of fear. As she rose to retire for the evening, adjusting the child's shawl and smoothing her gown, the Duke reached for her hand once more. His grip was firm, yet gentle, a deliberate reminder that the intimacy of trust could exist even in the midst of propriety. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we shall see what other challenges await. And we shall face them together." She felt her breath catch, both at the promise and the weight of uncertainty. The night outside was silent now, but the echoes of the day, the judgment, the scandal, the subtle victories, lingered in her mind. She understood that the path ahead would demand courage, poise, and a willingness to trust in the bond that had begun to take root between them. And yet, as she extinguished the final candle and prepared for sleep, a distant rustle in the corridors caught her attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible, yet it carried with it the unmistakable weight of expectation and challenge, a reminder that even within the sanctuary of the manor, the world's scrutiny was never fully absent. The morning arrived with a heavy stillness that pressed upon the manor as though the storm itself had followed them indoors, bearing tidings of change and consequence. A letter, hastily delivered by a breathless footman, lay upon the drawing-room table, its edges damp and curling with the remnants of snow. She lifted it with trembling fingers, the seal broken, and felt her pulse quicken, not with fear of the words themselves, but with the knowledge that any message arriving unbidden could carry both relief and ruin. The world outside their sanctuary remained unyielding, indifferent to kindness or courage, and she understood in that moment that the hours ahead would demand all the resilience she had so far cultivated. The Duke entered quietly, observing her as she unfolded the fragile sheet of paper. His gaze, steady and unwavering, seemed to anticipate her reaction, not with judgment, but with a profound awareness that mirrored the care he had shown since her arrival. "Do you fear what it contains?" he asked softly, the warmth in his tone a deliberate counterpoint to the cold ink and harsher realities beyond the estate walls. She shook her head, her eyes scanning the carefully penned words. A sudden loss, a claim of debt, a social imbroglio that threatened to unseat the delicate footing she had established, though not irreparable, each line carried the weight of potential scandal, a threat to the fragile trust between her and the Duke. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the immensity of responsibility that came with navigating a world that seemed intent on testing her at every turn. "You have already endured far more than most could bear," the Duke said, stepping closer, the subtle heat of his presence brushing her awareness. "And you have done so with dignity. Whatever storms may follow, know that we face them together." The words, spoken with quiet certainty, anchored her trembling heart. For the first time since she had arrived at the manor, she felt a sense of partnership that went beyond obligation or duty. It was a bond forged in adversity, a slow-burning trust that had grown through shared trials, through whispered words and careful gestures, and through the courage required to step into the unknown. Throughout the day, they moved in tandem through the minor crises that the letter precipitated. Servants were directed with calm authority, letters were penned with careful phrasing, and social obligations were navigated with precision. She found herself observing the Duke in ways she had not dared before, noting the subtle patience in his gestures, the deliberate kindness in his instructions, the unspoken awareness that he measured her not by flaw, but by character. In this, she began to recognize a love that was neither flashy nor dramatic, but grounded in respect, protection, and a quiet acknowledgement of her worth. As evening fell and the manor was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, the child slept soundly, cradled in the warmth of a familiar servant's care. She allowed herself a moment of quiet, reflecting on the weeks that had passed since her arrival. Each day had been a test, each encounter a negotiation of propriety, yet through it all, the Duke's presence had been an unbroken thread of stability, a tether that anchored her in a life she had scarcely imagined. The flicker of firelight danced across the polished floors, mirroring the tentative sparks of affection that had kindled between them. He approached her then, silent as the shadows stretching across the walls. She turned, and their eyes met, a depth of understanding passing between them that words could scarcely capture. "You have been remarkable," he said, voice low, carrying the weight of sincerity and admiration. "Not for perfection, nor for compliance with the expectations of others, but for the courage you have shown, the heart you have revealed, and the trust you have placed in me." Her breath caught, a fragile laugh escaping despite the lingering tension of the day. I have only tried to do what is right, sir. I am not certain that it is enough." He stepped closer, reaching for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers with deliberate tenderness. "It is more than enough," he said, voice steady, yet soft with unspoken emotion. "It is everything that matters." In that moment, the fragile walls she had constructed around her heart began to crumble, replaced by an undeniable warmth that spread through her chest. The trials, the scrutiny, the whispered doubts, all seemed to fade beneath the gravity of his presence. She realized, with a shock of clarity, that she had not merely survived, she had found a home, a sanctuary, and a man whose care transcended propriety, whose affection had grown quietly and inexorably into something she could scarcely deny. The Duke bent slightly, close enough that she felt the heat of his breath, and whispered the words that had haunted her imagination since her first arrival: "You are my wife now. Not merely by decree or circumstance, but by choice, by trust, and by the recognition of your worth." Tears pricked at her eyes, a mixture of relief, joy, and the lingering echo of fear that had accompanied her journey. She reached for him, pressing her hands against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the fabric of his coat. I believe it," she whispered, voice trembling yet firm. "I believe that I belong here, with you." He smiled, a quiet, intimate smile that spoke of patience, admiration, and the promise of love yet fully realized. "Then let this night mark the beginning," he said, his hand covering hers, a subtle but profound affirmation of shared commitment. "The beginning of a life unshaken by fear, guided by trust, and built upon the foundation of hearts that have chosen one another." The manor seemed to exhale around them, the flickering candlelight softening the shadows, the faint scent of pine and winter drift mingling with the warmth of the hearth. Outside, the snow had ceased its relentless assault, leaving a hush over the grounds that mirrored the fragile peace within. For the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself to imagine a future unencumbered by fear, where the trials of the past were merely preludes to joy yet to come. Yet even in this moment of quiet triumph, the world beyond the manor reminded her that life remained an intricate dance of circumstance and choice. A faint sound, a carriage wheel upon frozen gravel, a distant footstep, echoed through the corridors, a reminder that safety and certainty were never permanent. The Duke, ever aware, placed a reassuring hand upon her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement that they would face what came together. She pressed closer to him, feeling the warmth of his embrace, and allowed the tension in her shoulders to ease. The child, now stirring in sleep, reached out instinctively, and she gathered him against her side, realizing that this small family, unexpected, unplanned, yet profoundly cherished, was her anchor in the world. The Duke's gaze swept over her, the child, and the flickering hearth, a quiet promise lingering in his eyes. "Whatever comes," he said, voice low, deliberate, "we shall face it as one. And no whisper, no judgment, no challenge shall diminish what we have begun to build together." Her lips curved into a tentative smile, fragile yet genuine, as she recognized the truth in his words. The trials, the scrutiny, the uncertain beginnings, all had led to this moment, a quiet victory, a declaration of trust and affection, a sanctuary that could endure beyond the reach of gossip or circumstance. Yet as they stood together, hands entwined, the final echo of uncertainty lingered, a reminder that even the deepest bonds must weather the unforeseen, and that life's greatest joys are never without the subtle tremor of challenge. The snow lay silent outside, the manor cloaked in warmth and quiet, and she realized that this night, though triumphant, was but the first chapter in a story still unfolding, a tale of hearts that had chosen each other against the currents of fate. And as the candlelight flickered one last time, casting elongated shadows across the walls, a distant knock resounded at the manor door, soft, deliberate, and insistent. The sound, faint yet unmistakable, hinted at news, at consequence, at a world that refused to remain still. She glanced at the Duke, whose steady hand upon hers conveyed both reassurance and acknowledgement of the unknown, and for a heartbeat, the warmth of the moment mingled with the thrill of anticipation. The story was far from concluded, and though love had been declared and trust established, the path ahead remained uncertain, waiting to reveal its next chapter.